Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I'd like to welcome you back to our lecture series for World Civ 1. Today we're going to take a look at another religious topic, the foundation and spread of Islam. Islam is today the second largest religion in the world, is rapidly growing, and constitutes a very significant aspect of modern life. And so I thought it would be helpful to kind of take a look at the origins of Islam and how it kind of came about and came together. Islam's origins are, of course, in the area we call the Arabian Peninsula, located here. This would be Egypt and North Africa here. Iran, of course, as you can see on the map there. And then up here would be those traditional areas we talked about, known as Mesopotamia or the Middle East. As we can see, based on this kind of map here, we only have two major urban areas in Islam, or excuse me, in Arabia. We have the city of Medina to the north and the city of Mecca, which was by far the larger and most more important city. The remainder of the Arabian Peninsula was predominantly desert-like conditions, along with a few oases here and there, that gave rise to a population of what were referred to as Bedouin, or migratory animal herders, that would make up a small but significant portion of the Arabian people's population. Now, if we take a look at the rise of Islam, and we'll flash back to the map here in a minute, what we have to start talking about, of course, Muhammad, and to give a little bit of background about Arabian history. The Arabian people, prior to the year 632, the Arabian people were predominantly what we would call polytheistic or paganistic from a Christian perspective. They worshipped multiple gods and goddesses. They worshipped their religious system was very similar in terms of a lot of characteristics to those traditional types of religions that we've talked about, whether it be in India or in China or even in ancient Greece and Rome. The area itself was predominantly isolated because of its rather harsh terrain. And so what predominantly the Arabs did in the bulk of the time period before 600 is they would migrate up into the travel or into the trading routes that kind of crisscrossed into Africa from the Middle East and then also crossed into Europe and back into Asia. And the Arabian merchants would actually travel up in what were called caravans, and they would basically settle down and kind of camp out for a few weeks, trading their goods with whoever came by, picking up information as well as picking up other goods, foreign goods. And then after about 3 or 4 weeks, they would then basically migrate back down into the cities, and they would then sell their goods. And so the basic, if you will, economy of the cities was to be the exchange place between the caravan merchants who basically traveled up and out of the Arabian Peninsula and then back down, and then other groups of people that not only might have lived in the cities but also traveled into the cities in order to basically connect with these markets. And because of that, the two cities, the Medina and Mecca, they became the centers of both the trade world for the Arabian people, as well as the kind of cultural and religious centers. Mecca in particular was a religious center that housed the so-called Kaaba, which was kind of this building that housed a meteorite, which was kind of which was a primary focus of the the Arabian polytheistic religion. And so, when we start the story of Islam, we start with its founder, Muhammad. Muhammad was an orphan who had been adopted into a very wealthy caravan trading family. His father was, I just drew a brain freeze there. His name was Abu Bakr. And basically, the Bakr family were one of the primary merchant families in the city of Mecca. And Muhammad, when he was adopted, he basically married into the family. Eventually, he married Abu Bakr's oldest daughter and kind of took over the family business, so to speak. It was on one of these caravan journeys that Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was visited by the angel Gabriel. The same Gabriel, of course, that we see at the start of the other two religions, whether it be the start of Judaism in the form of Gabriel being identified as one of the angels that was constantly in contact with the Israeli people. And we also have, of course, the story of the visitation, in which the angel Gabriel appears to Mary in the Christian tradition and basically tells Mary that she is going to give birth to Jesus and is going to give birth to the Messiah of the Christian religion. So we have, again, Gabriel showing up. In the Islamic tradition, he is going to dictate the Quran, part of the Quran, to Muhammad, and he is going to convert. He's going to tell Muhammad that the one true religion is a monotheistic religion, which is, in fact, an evolution of Judaism and Christianity, trying to correct the errors of those previous two religions. And so Muhammad returns to Mecca with this new monotheistic tradition. But as you might expect, the people of Mecca, in particular the leaders of Mecca, do not receive his message well. They will wind up eventually persecuting Muhammad and his followers, the first Muslims, and the Bakr family. They will persecute them and drive them out of Mecca in the year 622. This event is called the Hijra and kind of represents year one for the Muslim calendar. From 622 to 630, Muhammad then travels north to the city of Medina. He will then negotiate the end of a civil war in Medina, thereby becoming the leader of Medina and converting all of the people of Medina to Islam. After a few years, after 8 years, Muhammad will return at the head of an army where he will then conquer Mecca. According to Islamic tradition, it is a bloodless war in which the citizens of Mecca converted of their own free will, without any bloodshed, to the religion of Islam. And then, basically, Muhammad moved his capital of his growing kingdom or his growing empire. He moved it to the city of Mecca. He basically took the Kaaba and he removed all of its polytheistic, paganistic elements, and he made it kind of the focal point and center of his new religion, his monotheistic religion of Islam. For 2 more years, then Muhammad basically worked to spread Islam. Right before his death in 632, we have, according to Islamic tradition, the story of Muhammad's spirit journey, in which he basically spirit journeyed to the hill upon which the old temple, the ancient Temple of Solomon, was built. And from that point on earth, according to Islamic tradition, he was taken into heaven, where he was given the second half of the Quran, and basically returned to earth to kind of put his affairs in order and to basically put the Quran together and to establish this Islamic faith. Upon his return to Mecca, he eventually died in 632. And it's at this point that Islam faces a serious crisis, which we'll get to after we talk a little bit about how the religion kind of functions. When we take a look at Islam as a religion, we can identify what are called the 5 pillars. Islam is based on 5 pillars, the first being Shahada, or in English, testimony. And the idea behind this is that in order to be Muslim, one simply has to profess their faith, which would be the testimony that there's only one God, Allah is his name, and Muhammad is his greatest prophet. If you repeat that phraseology 3 times, in front of witnesses, according to the Islamic tradition, that in fact is your, quote, baptism or your entrance into the Islamic faith. As you probably know, Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day, in Arabic known as Salah. And that prayer is always facing east or facing basically Mecca, unless you are west of Mecca, and then you would face Mecca, you would face west. Point number 3 is referred to as zakat or almsgiving. Islam is a very community-based religion, and it basically requires its members to donate both money and resources and time to the community in terms of helping and to kind of progress the Islamic faith. There are periodic periods of fasting known as Sam in the Islamic calendar. And last but not least, we have pillar number 5, which is pilgrimage or Hajj. And what that refers to is that every Muslim is required to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. And if they cannot do so because they're physically unable, they can then pay for someone else to make that pilgrimage for them. Now, That's basically the religion of Islam. It's a fairly simplistic religion. It is urban-based, but it is also devoid of kind of a lot of theological principles that might define, for example, Christianity. The God, Allah, is a kind of it's not simplistic, but it's a very basic belief in a fundamental, omnipotent, omnipresent God. Much like the belief of the Hebrewistic Judaistic God of God the Father, or basically, in terms of the Trinity, most associated with God the Father in terms of the Christian religion. And so the argument made by Islam is that the Christians, in fact, got confused about Jesus. He was not a son of God, but he was, in fact, a prophet, the second greatest prophet to Muhammad. And their belief then is that all of the Christian theological ideas that kind of come about because of the belief in the Trinity, as well as, the reverence of Mary, and all of that kind of ideas, that as we talked about in terms of Christian history, kind of sparked a lot of variations of Christianity in the form of what we call heresy. The Muslim religion basically doesn't have any of that complexity within itself. It's a very simplistic, basic, fundamental religion that seeks to kind of strip Christianity of a lot of that ideology about Jesus and to return it back to a more kind of Judaistic-based belief. If we take a look at Christianity and Islam and kind of compare the two, we see a lot of similarities. Both are based upon faith. Both basically talk about prayer and place a central position of prayer in one's life. Both have periods of fasting and as well as requirement of almsgiving. And even though we might not know it today in the Christian religion, definitely in the early Christian church and in the medieval church, there was a heavy focus upon pilgrimage. Particularly, as we'll kind of talk about when we talk about the Crusades, a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and in particular to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a church built upon the site that is believed to be the spot where the resurrection of Jesus Christ occurred, according to Christian tradition. And so we see a lot of similarities between Islam and Christianity in terms of some of how the religion is practiced. Now, also some similarities that we can highlight is that at the time period Islam came along, approximately about the 600s, Christianity had already undergone a kind of merging with politics, as we kind of talked about under Constantine and later popes like Leo I and others. And so when Islam is originally created, it is created as a quasi-political and religious system, as well as incorporating within itself also a social system, because based upon the law of the Shahada, based upon the law of the Quran, as well as the different legal principles of Islam, that becomes your political system, it becomes your political law code, and it also becomes your social system, your social moral code. And so what we see coming together in terms of Islam is much like Christianity was at the time it was formed. It is a social, political, and religious system all rolled up into one. And because of that, it is important to remember that because of that very nature, it is politically unstable in the sense that religious authority can very quickly translate into spiritual authority, which can translate very quickly into basically political domination. So, political authority can be seen as religious authority, and religious authority can also be interpreted as political authority, which lends itself to a very fluid movement, if you will, of authoritative structures being grounded in both spiritual matters and politics. As we mentioned, Islamic law is based on the Quran and also based upon later writings of different Muslim leaders. Now, getting back to that crisis, with the death of Muhammad, the problem is that Muhammad doesn't have any male sons that can inherit politically the rulership of the Islamic kingdom, as well as being a leader of the Islamic people. All that Muhammad has are daughters. And so Because Islam is predominantly based upon a patriarchal system, extremely rigid patriarchal system, women are not allowed to wield that kind of authoritative power that you would need in a ruler and a leader of the religion. And so what happens with the death of the prophet in 632 is we have an almost immediate civil war breakout you have two candidates that are vying for control of Islam. The first is Abu Bakr, first convert of Islam and the father-in-law of Muhammad. And the second is Ali ibn Abu Talib, who is the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad. He'd married Muhammad's oldest daughter. And so basically what we have in terms of this kind of civil religious strife is we have a candidate who's extremely old in terms of, late in life. They are one of the first converts to Islam, but by and large, they are predominantly kind of not going to get a whole lot done because of their age and kind of mentality. Conversely, we have a very young candidate in the form of Ali ibn Abu Talib, and he already has children, which basically represents they are the blood grandchildren of the prophet, and they are male. So it basically sets up a fairly easy, consistent succession to where the family of the prophet will remain in power. Now, these two factions then are developed to kind of support either candidate. The Sunni faction, which are by far more numerous and, kind of stronger of the two, they support Abu Bakr, while the Shia, or the Shiites, support Ali ibn Abu Talib. And basically, the long story short is this. Abu Bakr gained support of the military foundation of the Islamic kingdom. He will gain support of that military base, and he will become the next caliph, if you will. And Ali will actually recede into the background. But the strife caused by this political dispute will eventually erupt into the creation of two separate kind of sects of Islam, which are very similar but do believe different things based upon what they accept from the Quran and how they interpret the Quran. These two sects will then basically become if you will, a dichotomy of Islam that still exists today. So Islam will become basically segmented into two separate groups, and the Shia and the Sunni will then begin to wage war on each other periodically all the way up until the present day. The first outbreak of these religious wars are the so-called Ridda Wars from 632 to 633, in which Abu Bakr gives kind of reign to the military under the leadership of Khalid bin Walid to kind of take control and to put down the Shia revolt. Shortly thereafter, after the Ridda Wars are ended, Islam will then expand out of the Arabian Peninsula and will very quickly, within basically 100 years, expand to incorporate a lot of the known world. And so basically this map kind of should represent that. Here, let me move that dialog box up there. Islam is going to start here, and then over the course of the next 100 years, it's going to expand out. It's going to conquer the remnants of that Sassanid Persian Empire, and then it's going to expand into modern-day Iran. It's going to expand into Africa and all the way up into modern-day Spain. And this expansion is going to be extremely rapid, but it's also going to be, there are going to be reasons for that. One of the primary reasons for expansion of Islam into Christian areas is primarily because a lot of the areas that it expanded into, primarily the Middle East, Africa, and Egypt and North Africa, were already kind of fragmented by heresy. And so when the Islam came into power in these areas, they actually ironically brought religious freedom or religious toleration to heretic Christians. Because, prior to this, the Byzantine Empire, which controlled these areas, had been trying to root out and destroy heresy. And so, according to the Islamic population, all Christians were wrong, all Christians were mistaken, so it didn't really matter what variation of Christianity you were. They treated all Christians the same, which meant that basically Christians were not forced to convert to Islam. they were allowed to practice their own religion if they paid an extra tax and also had to deal with the other consequences of not being Islamic, which primarily was, if you were non-Muslim, you could not participate in government, you could not hold a government position of authority, and you could not preach or try to spread your religion. The so-called term peoples of the book refers to this designation of both Christians and Jewish people that allowed them to practice their religion. Now, the Muslims did want to convert these people over time, but they wanted to convert them over the course of centuries, all the while using that extra revenue, that extra money from the taxes to kind of fuel the expansion of Islam. Very, very quickly, as you can see here, under the bulk of this kind of expansion took place under the third caliph. If Muhammad is the first caliph and Abu Bakr is the second, the third caliph would be the leader of the military, known as Umar ibn al-Khattab. He was primarily a military-based power, and it's really under his leadership that Islam continued to expand. They took Persia, as I mentioned, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. One thing I do want to point out on this slide is the so-called Pact of Umar. And what this refers to is a traditional agreement in which Umar believed that Jerusalem and the area around Jerusalem should remain kind of a neutral area where both Christians, Muslims, and Jews could come and worship and practice their religion. Now, one of the big things that Umar did when he conquered Palestine is he did, in fact, build a monument to that traditional spirit journey that Muhammad made from the hill that housed basically the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Jerusalem. He built a mosque there known as the Dome of the Rock. And that mosque still stands there today. And as we kind of mentioned when we talked about Israel and Israeli history, that mosque still represents kind of a focal point of the Muslims. It's probably the third most holy site in Islam. But at the same time, it prevents the creation of, or the recreation, if you will, of the Jewish temple, which means that it prevents the Hebrew people, the Judaistic religious group, from practicing their religion to the fullest. And it's become a sense, if you will, a center of contention and debate, because obviously the Israelis would like to recreate their temple and re-practice their religion, but at the same time, destroying that mosque could result in war, ultimately possibly resulting in World War III. So the Pact of Umar, though, just to get back to the Pact of Umar, the Pact of Umar was established in 638, which was going to remain kind of the ideal that Jerusalem would be a neutral place, allowing all three groups of believers, peoples of the book, to worship in freedom. Now, just to fast forward a little bit, we do have an expansion again of war under Ali. Ali ibn Abu Talib, once again, becomes the focal point of a Shiite revolution to kind of overturn the militaristic domination of Islam. The Shiites basically have regrouped and they form themselves under Ali. And we have the outbreak of another civil war. This war takes place from 657 to 661. And it will ultimately result in the assassination of Ali and the death of almost all of the members of Muhammad's family. There is a small sect of Shiite Muslims that believe that the last survivor of Muhammad was actually assumed into heaven so that he could be protected by Allah, and that he will return with Jesus at the end of time to kind of usher in the end of the world. There is a small sect of Shiites that believe that, but it is a small sect, it's a minority of an already small minority known as the Shiite Muslim population. Long story short, this civil war basically forces a almost complete break from Islam in terms of connecting with Muhammad or Muhammad's representatives. The family that's going to take over are going to be the old rulers of Mecca. They're known as the Umayyad dynasty. They will basically take over the leadership of Islam, and they will then move the capital of the Islamic kingdom now to a more central location known as the city of Damascus, which, if we go back to the map, the city of Damascus would be located primarily right here near the coast of the Mediterranean. And as you can see, it's definitely at the center of these trade routes and would also kind of be a center of information exchange that would enable the Umayyads to better rule their kingdom. Now, it's going to be under the Umayyads that the Umayyads will continue to push the expansion of Islam, and they will get as far as basically conquering parts of Spain. However, if we move the dialog box out, that is eventually going to be a problem for the Umayyads, because as they focus more on expanding into the east in terms of India and expanding into the west in terms of Spain, they're going to actually lose control of the military in the Middle East and North Africa, primarily Egypt. And so what you can see in this last section here is we see over time, we see the fragmentation of the Islamic kingdom or the Islamic empire into several smaller empires. We have what's called the Abbasid Empire of the Middle East. We have the Fatimid dynasty in North Africa and Egypt. And last but not least, we have the continued Umayyad dynasty, which basically has to migrate and abandon their capital city in Damascus and move into a capital city in Spain, which predominantly is known as Cordova. And so basically, the history of Islam is really one of fragmentation. Islam was only unified for a short period of time under the leadership of the Prophet. With the death of Muhammad in 632, we have the rise of the first Ridda Wars, or the first civil war, which gives birth to the Shiites and the Sunnis. And then over time, we're going to have the outbreak of war again under Ali, and then later again in later governments. So much to the point now that the Shiite minority still represent a very revolutionary and a very targeted area of Islam, depending on who's in charge. As recently as basically the 2000s AD or CE, one of Saddam Hussein's actions as leader of Iraq was to try and suppress and eradicate the Shiite minority. And he massacred thousands of Shiites in the country of Iraq. At the same time, once the United States was trying to kind of put together and build a new Iraq, the issue of the Shiite minority was a very important issue that caused a lot of debates and a lot of struggles in trying to put that new government in Iraq together. So after the fragmentation of Islam, what we have now operating in terms of the Middle East is we have primarily 3 Islamic kingdoms that make war on each other, while also making war on the Byzantine Empire and also on the French in terms of their attempted invasion into France, which is something we'll talk about in the next lecture when we kind of set the stage and talk about the early Middle Ages in a lecture that I call Early Middle Ages 1. I hope this has been informative. If you have questions, please let me know. Once again, I thank you for listening to the lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.